Many people have adopted this idea of intermittent fasting, right? And why not? Intermittent fasting, also known as time-restricted feeding, has been shown to improve metabolic flexibility, reduce inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, stabilize blood sugar, promote fat loss, and even support healthier circadian rhythms. But there's a problem. About 80% of people are not doing it the most effective way. The most common pattern is sometimes called late time-restricted feeding, which means skipping breakfast, eating the first meal, around noon, and then continuing eating until the evening. And despite its popularity, the research consistently shows the opposite pattern works better. In other words, eating more in the morning and the early afternoon and finishing around 3 or 4 p.m., so-called early time-restricted feeding. And it provides stronger metabolic benefits, including better insulin sensitivity, better glycemic control, lower blood pressure, better sleep, and even greater fat loss. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it consistently does that. This is one of the clearest patterns in metabolic research. So today what I want to do is break down this idea of why early time-restricted feeding makes physiologic sense, what the research actually shows when you compare early versus late feeding windows. So first, let's look at why early eating makes physiologic sense. Basically, it's because we're not machines, right? We are circadian organisms. Every major organ system in the body, whether it's your liver, your pancreas, or gut, or fat cells, they all run on a 24-hour rhythm. Insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning and steadily drops through the day. That means the exact same meal causes much larger glucose spikes at night than it does at, say, 9 a.m. Whereas cortisol naturally peaks shortly after waking, which helps you maintain your metabolism and handle nutrients efficiently. Then cortisol declines through the day. And then conversely, melatonin, your sleep hormone, rises in the evening. And once melatonin goes up, your pancreas actually reduces its insulin output and your tissues become more insulin resistant. So if you put all those things together, right, being more insulin resistant in the evening, along with not producing as much insulin later in the day, and the result is that your body is less able to handle blood sugar later in the day. So it would make sense to eat more in the morning and the early afternoon, and then fast later in the day. And even though I didn't show it on the graph, gut motility and digestion also slow down at night, which means your food sits longer and blood sugar stays elevated longer. So again, when you put all this together, it's obvious, right? Your body is wired to handle food early, not late. So it would make sense to eat more in the morning and early afternoon than it would be to eat later in the day. And that's the logic behind early time-restricted feeding. You're eating when your metabolism is on and fasting when your metabolism is off. So when you skip breakfast and push your meals later, you're eating when your metabolism is least prepared to handle it. Early time-restricted feeding does the opposite, right? Eating early in the day, fasting later at night, it aligns eating with your body's biologic clock. And so, that's all good in theory, but what does the research actually say? Well, first of all, early time-restricted feeding improves insulin resistance more than late time-restricted feeding. And that was clearly outlined in this 2023 network meta-analysis comparing early versus late feeding windows. They compiled the data from 12 other different studies, and they found that early time-restricted feeding improves insulin resistance significantly more than late time-restricted feeding, including a 0.44 change in the HOMA-IR. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that the HOMA-IR is one of the best sort of gold standards that we have for detecting insulin resistance. So a decline of about 0.5 point in the HOMA-IR is very significant. Now, secondly, early time-restricted feeding improves the 24-hour glucose control. In tightly controlled feeding studies where calories and foods were identical, early time-restricted feeding lowered 24-hour glucose, fasting glucose, glucose variability, and even glucose spikes, whereas late time-restricted feeding doesn't show those improvements. In fact, a recent systematic review and meta-analysis that looked at the data from 18 other studies, they said Our meta-analysis suggests that time-restricted eating can reduce hemoglobin A1C and insulin levels, and that timing of food intake is a crucial factor in the metabolic benefit of time-restricted eating, as only early time-restricted feeding is capable of reducing fasting glucose levels in subjects with overweight or obesity. Now, thirdly, early time-restricted feeding improves blood pressure, oxidative stress, and appetite even without weight loss. So, one landmark early time-restricted feeding trial found that participants improved insulin sensitivity, lowered blood pressure, reduced oxidative stress, and felt less hungry in the evening, all without any change in body weight. So what that means then is that the benefit wasn't just from losing weight, it was from shifting meal timing. And this wasn't just one study. Again, these findings have been corroborated by subsequent reviews and meta-analysis, which note that early time-restricted feeding can lower blood pressure and improve metabolic health markers, even when weight loss is not present. Now, fourth, early time-restricted feeding actually improves sleep significantly. The so-called TRIM trial, where people ate their meals earlier and stopped eating earlier, slept 55 minutes longer, and fell asleep earlier compared to those who ate later. So it's not just some small tweak, right? That's a major shift in your sleep schedule just by moving your dinner earlier. Now, the science shows that meal timing doesn't just affect your metabolism, right? It helps reset your sleep clock, making it easier to wind down and get restorative rest. In fact, a recent paper published by the American Heart Association just a couple weeks ago, in October of 2025, they say, because mealtime is the Zeitgeber for circadian rhythms, time-restricted eating patterns could provide strategy to maintain alignment of peripheral clocks to the central clock. Now, the fifth thing that the research shows about early time-restricted feeding is that it probably reduces fat mass more effectively. A 2025 randomized controlled trial found that early time-restricted feeding combined with calorie restriction led to greater reductions in fat mass, better fasting glucose, and lower diastolic blood pressure than late time-restricted feeding with the same calories. So I'll just say it again. This was done with the same calories in both groups. Now again, this reduction in fat mass with early time-restricted feeding wasn't just some one-off study. It's been confirmed by systematic reviews and meta-analysis where they looked at all the studies. Now, again, if we need more, the sixth thing is a lot of people will say, well, the problem with closing your kitchen early in the afternoon and not eating until the next morning is a social problem, right? A lot of our socialization centers around meals. But there are certainly other ways to socialize. In fact, a 2024 analysis reported almost identical adherence, about 81 to 82% for both early and late time-restricted feeding. So this idea that early time-restricted feeding is too difficult, it's not supported by real-world data. Now, before we move on, let's just address one big question that comes up all the time. Is early time-restricted feeding just calorie restrictions in disguise, right? You may have heard that intermittent fasting doesn't outperform standard dieting with the same calorie restrictions. And that is partly true, but it misses something really important. So researchers have often mixed these things together with three different questions, basically. First, does time-restricted feeding help people lose weight? And the answer is certainly yes, because people naturally eat fewer calories when their window to eat is shorter, right? The second question that the researchers ask is, if two groups eat exactly the same number of calories, does adding a fasting window improve weight loss? And this question gets a little tricky because early time-restricted feeding does seem to improve weight loss more than late time-restricted feeding. So we can't really group them together in sort of like one blanket statement. And we already spoke about that in this video. But the third question is even more different. Does early time-restricted feeding improve metabolism independent of calories, right? And most control studies say yes, right? In trials where all these calories were matched, meals were identical, and body weight was held stable, early time-restricted feeding still improved insulin sensitivity and fasting and evening glucose, blood pressure, oxidative stress, appetite regulation, and circadian alignment, which helps with sleep, right? And those effects happen without weight loss, meaning it's not just about eating less, it's about eating earlier. And also, when researchers compare early time restricted feeding to late time restricted feeding, early time restricted feeding consistently outperforms late time restricted feeding, even with the same calorie intake. So no, early time restricted feeding is not just calorie restriction in disguise. I mean, calories matter, right? But timing adds a different metabolic benefit, especially when insulin sensitivity and blood sugar control are important. So if you're gonna fast, don't just shorten your window, shift it earlier. So the take-home point is that intermittent fasting can be incredibly helpful, right? But timing does matter. Early time restricted feeding consistently outperforms late time restricted feeding for insulin sensitivity and glucose control and blood pressure and sleep, appetite regulation, and fat mass, right? So if you're gonna fast, do it in a way that works with your biology, not against it. Eat earlier, sleep better, and let your body's natural rhythm do what it was designed to do.